Sherry Roach was a 17-year-old living in a group home in San Mateo, California in 1976. She and her younger brother Jerry had endured a turbulent childhood in Santa Rosa, growing up in what Jerry described as a violent household. This instability led Sherry to spend time in multiple foster homes and group homes for her care and safety. However, these environments were, to put it mildly, less than ideal, and Sherry often ran away. Despite all these challenges, Sherry remained extremely close with her brother. Jerry recalled that whenever Sherry ran away, as she often did, she would always reach out to let him know she was safe. By June 1976, Sherry was staying at a group home in San Mateo. She also held a part-time job in San Francisco, which is about 20 miles away from San Mateo. She often relied on public transit or hitchhiking to get to and from work, the latter of which wasn't uncommon for teens in the 1970s. On the morning of June 8, 1976, Sherry left the group home to catch a bus to her job in San Francisco. It was a routine she had done many times before. However, on this day, she never arrived back at the group home. A counselor at the home reported Sherry missing when she failed to return from work as expected. When Sherry's disappearance was reported, the San Mateo Police Department launched an investigation, though by today's standards it was relatively limited. According to Detective Tom Paulin of the San Mateo Police Department, speaking in February 2020, quote, "The officers back in 1976 did a cursory interview with some people that either worked with her or that knew of her, and there weren't any substantial leads at that particular time." Reading between the lines, it appears that they simply assumed she was a runaway, and because she had little in the way of family to advocate for her, her case went cold. Indeed, Sherry had a known history of running away from home or foster placements, which may have led authorities to suspect she left voluntarily. However, given Sherry's pattern of always calling her brother when she ran off, the fact that no one heard from her at all after June 1976 was deeply alarming. This departure from her usual behavior suggested that Sherry hadn't simply started a new life elsewhere. Something had prevented her from making contact. Although the investigation went cold, it was never fully closed. Given that Sherry frequently hitchhiked, investigators considered the grim possibility that she could have fallen prey to a predator who targeted young women. As any true crime aficionado knows, California in the 1970s was the epicenter of a serial predator epidemic. Investigators also looked into unusual cases like the November 1978 Jonestown incident in Guyana, which involved many Bay Area residents. Yet upon further investigation, Sherry's name didn't appear on the lists of those who perished in that tragedy. Decades passed with little progress until a surprising new clue emerged in 2020. Sherry's mother, who still lived in Northern California, discovered an old photograph while going through family belongings. The photo, dated 1975 on the back, showed Sherry as a teenager, standing close to an unidentified young man, with his arm around her shoulders. What made the discovery significant is that Sherry's family had never seen this picture before, nor did they recognize the man in it. In fact, relatives had only heard vague rumors back in the 1970s that Sherry might have had an older boyfriend, but they had no name or details. The newly unearthed photo was potentially one of the last pictures taken of Sherry before she disappeared, and the man beside her immediately became a person of interest. San Mateo police publicly released the photo in February 2020 in hopes that someone might identify the mystery man. Authorities have described him as a black male, likely in his early 20s and approximately 6 feet tall. Notably, the man has not officially been labeled a suspect, but given that he was apparently close to Sherry not long before she vanished, police consider him a critical witness at the very least. Despite the release of this picture, no new evidence has come from it, and the man has not been identified. The Bible John case refers to a series of 3 unsolved slayings of young women in Glasgow, Scotland, between 1968 and 1969. These crimes were all potentially carried out by the same seemingly religiously obsessed man. The victims were Patricia Docker, 25, Jemima MacDonald, 32, and Helen Puttock, 29. They were all mothers who had spent evenings at Glasgow's popular Barrowland Ballroom nightclub immediately before being slain. They were found beaten and strangled, and each woman was on her period at the time of death, a grim detail that later fueled theories about the perpetrator's motive. Patricia Docker, an auxiliary nurse, was the first known victim. On February 23, 1968, her body was found in a Glasgow alleyway near her home in the Battlefield district. Many of her personal belongings, including her clothing, handbag, and watch, were missing, suggesting the perp removed them from the scene. Initially, Docker's slaying received limited leads, and police struggled due to a lack of witnesses and physical evidence. Her parents had thought she went to a different dance hall that night, and it was over a week before a witness came forward to confirm seeing her at the Barrowland Ballroom. This fact led to a significant delay in the initial investigation, and the case went cold. In August 1969, a second attack re-energized the investigation. Jemima MacDonald, a 32-year-old mother of 3, spent the evening of Saturday, August 16, 1969, dancing at the Barrowland Ballroom. When she failed to return home, her sister grew concerned. Tragically, on August 18th, Jemima's body was discovered in an abandoned tenement building by her own sister after local children spoke of finding a body. Unlike Docker, she was found fully clothed, but investigators noted striking similarities between the two cases. Both women had spent their last evenings at the Barrowland, both were strangled, and were on their periods when slain. On October 31, 1969, the body of Helen Puttock was found behind her Glasgow home, marking the third and final known act of this perpetrator. Helen, 29, had also visited the Barrowland Ballroom the night before, accompanied by her sister, Jean Langford. And keep Jean Langford in mind, because her evidence is going to be extremely important going forward in this case. They met 2 men at the dance hall who both called themselves John. After midnight, the group of 4 left together. One man departed earlier to catch a bus, and Helen and Jean shared a taxi with the other John. During the taxi ride, this well-spoken man revealed oddly intense views. He spoke disapprovingly of married women attending nightclubs and dance halls and referenced the Bible, repeatedly remarking on Old Testament punishments for adultery. Jean also remembered that he mentioned he didn't drink on New Year's Eve because he preferred to spend his time praying. These comments made a strong impression on Jean. The man insisted on dropping Jean off first, even though her home was farther, leaving him alone with Helen. It was the last time Jean saw her sister alive. The next morning, Helen Puttock was found in her backyard, partially clothed and brutally beaten. With the third slaying's obvious parallels to the others, a young mother attacked after a Barrowland night out. Police were convinced they faced a serial perpetrator. The manhunt for Bible John escalated rapidly after Helen was discovered. Jean Langford provided a detailed description of the suspect, a tall, slim, well-dressed man in his mid-20s with short, reddish-blonde hair and overlapping front teeth. Detectives widely distributed the drawing. Interestingly, they noted that his hairstyle was so unfashionable that a local barber may recognize the cut, and ended up showing it to almost 500 local barbers, with no leads. The investigation soon became one of the most intensive ever seen in Scotland. Over 100 detectives were assigned full-time, and more than 50,000 witness statements were taken. Additionally, thousands of potential suspects were questioned within the first year. Undercover officers even patrolled Glasgow dance halls, including the Barrowland, hoping Bible John might return to his hunting ground. Despite the massive manhunt and numerous tips, no arrest was made. By the early 1970s, the trail had gone cold. Some officers theorized that the unknown perpetrator might have died, been incarcerated for another crime, or that he may have been investigated and ruled out as a suspect. And trust me, you're going to want to keep that last point in the back of your mind. Others thought he may have simply left the area, perhaps explaining why the slaying stopped as suddenly as they began. With no further cases linked to Bible John, the case gradually moved into the realm of speculation. One early avenue of suspicion was that the slayings might not have been the work of a random predator at all, but rather the result of separate domestic crimes. In later reviews of the case, some detectives noted that both Patricia Docker and Jemima McDonald had troubled marital histories. Docker was estranged from her husband Alex at the time of her death. The two were in the process of divorce, and Alex was on leave in Glasgow that week. He was an early suspect, as investigators learned he had a potential motive and even checked into a hotel with another woman the day after Patricia's slaying. This was seen as perhaps a celebratory measure taken by Alex Docker, though nothing could be proven. Likewise, Jemima McDonald had recently separated from her husband and moved back to Glasgow. These connections led some within law enforcement to believe that at least two of the three Bible John cases might actually have been unrelated attacks by people known to the victims. Another suspect emerged years after the Bible John terror, John Irvine McInnes, a former soldier and a cousin of a very senior Glasgow police official. McInnes was never publicly named during the original inquiry, but a secret 1995 review of the case zeroed in on him as a potential Bible John. Detectives in that review suspected that McInnes might have been the unidentified man in the taxi with Helen Puttock. Further, they even suggested that the original lead investigator, Joe Beatty, deliberately steered attention away from McInnes because McInnes's cousin was his friend. In 1995, police obtained permission to exhume John McInnes's body. McInnes had reached his end voluntarily in 1980. Thankfully, despite the Bible John slayings having taken place in the late 1960s, all biological evidence was preserved. The results were inconclusive and the genetic sample did not match, nor definitively exclude, McInnes. Notably, in a 2022 BBC podcast, the detectives who re-examined the case in 1995 indicated that they would have arrested McInnes for the slaying of Helen Puttock if he had been alive still. Notably and somewhat oddly, despite incredible improvements in DNA analysis since the mid-90s, the evidence hasn't been retested as yet. That said, the involvement of McInnes remains a controversial theory. While McInnes fit many aspects of the profile, such as being from a strict religious background, Jean Langford couldn't identify him conclusively as the man from the cab. The most famous theory to emerge in modern times is the possible link between Bible John and convicted serial perpetrator Peter Tobin. Tobin, who was from Glasgow, was found guilty of 3 slayings between 1991 and 2006. In 2006, after Tobin's arrest, detectives launched Operation Anagram to retrace his life and see if he could be tied to other unsolved crimes. Several intriguing connections came to light. Tobin had lived in Glasgow in the late 1960s, not far from the Barrowland. He even married his first wife in August 1969 after meeting her at the Barrowland ballroom itself in 1968. Now, to be fair, this isn't quite as odd as I initially thought it was, given that the venue has a capacity of almost 2,000 people. Further, he was known for his violent hatred towards women. All 3 of his former wives later described the already violent Tobin flying into a rage when they were on their periods. Investigators have long suspected the Bible John perpetrator targeted his victims during this time of the month. This behavioral parallel, along with reports that Tobin was deeply religious, supported this theory. Further, Tobin was known to use the alias John Semple. Jean Langford couldn't remember the last name Bible John gave exactly, but believed that it was Templeton. Investigators and theorists have noted that Semple sounds extremely close to Temple. However, there's no hard evidence linking Tobin to the Bible John slayings, and there's good evidence that he didn't do it. Going against the theory is the fact that Tobin moved to Brighton, England in early August 1969. His ex-wife has vehemently denied he could have slipped away to Glasgow to commit the final two horrendous acts. Furthermore, Tobin was 5'6", and Jean Langford had remembered Bible John being a notably tall individual. I think it's also important to note that Tobin and Bible John simply really don't bear any meaningful physical resemblance. Tobin has dark hair and dark eyes, while Bible John, even when seen in low light, was identified as having reddish blonde hair and blue eyes. Interestingly, some investigators who've worked on the Bible John case have commented on the strong internal disagreements in the investigation over Tobin being Bible John. That said, the anti-Tobin camp appears to have won out, with the Tobin theory now largely being confined to amateur theories rather than official theories. Personally, I think John McInnes needs yet another glance with modernized forensic techniques. It's important to remember that all three of the women were young mothers. The authorities may be able to bring significant closure to their now adult children by using these modern techniques. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and most importantly, share this video with your friends and family. In May 1990, 19-year-old Chad Maurer disappeared from his hometown of Madison, Wisconsin, under mysterious circumstances. He had been on a lunch break from his new job at a bike shop when he left home to return to work, but he never arrived. 2 days later, on May 21st, Chad's body was discovered in his car inside an unlocked garage on Chicago's South Side, about 150 miles from Madison. Chicago authorities initially reported that Chad died by his own volition via carbon monoxide poisoning. In support of this, they noted that he was found in the driver's seat with the car's ignition on, the gas tank empty, and the battery was dead. No substances were found in his system, and at first glance there were no obvious fatal injuries, lending some credibility to the authorities' initial theory. Chad's shocked parents, however, immediately doubted that their son, an upbeat teen with plans to move to Colorado for college, would drive to an unfamiliar Chicago neighborhood to do that. Their suspicions would soon be bolstered by troubling evidence suggesting Chad's death wasn't voluntary at all. When Chad's parents viewed their son's body at the funeral home, they noticed clear signs of injury that had been overlooked. Chad's knuckles were skinned down to the bone and he had bruises on his face, indicating he'd been in a fight or struggle. The funeral home also noted significant bruising on Chad's lower abdominal area. These findings didn't square with the Chicago police's initial conclusion that there was no evidence of foul play or any trauma on the body. Additionally, Chad's clothing raised alarms. His shirt was stained with blood, further suggesting a violent altercation. Perhaps most puzzling, crime scene photos showed a jacket in the car that didn't belong to Chad. He hadn't even taken a coat when he left home that cool day, yet there was this unfamiliar jacket on the seat next to his body. When the Maurers asked Chicago police to examine this jacket, they learned it had gone missing. According to a Chicago detective, the car's window had been broken, and someone apparently stole the jacket before the vehicle could be towed to a secure facility. This loss of potential evidence heightened the family's concern that something criminal had happened. Faced with these inconsistencies, Chad's family urged their local authorities in Wisconsin to get involved. The Dane County coroner examined Chad's body, and found additional injuries that the Chicago coroner hadn't documented. One critical detail emerged from the autopsy. The level of carbon monoxide in Chad's blood was 74%. Such a high concentration is well above what's typically seen in cases where people do it themselves. This suggested that Chad was unconscious when the car filled with carbon monoxide. In other words, it appeared Chad had been rendered unable to escape and then placed in the car. Confronted with this evidence of foul play, the Cook County medical examiner changed the manner of death to undetermined in 1991, and authorities launched a full renewed investigation. And of course, by this time, a year had passed since Chad's death, a fact which significantly hampered the investigation. With the case reopened, detectives explored how and why Chad Mauer ended up dead in Chicago. An early tip came in October 1990 after Chad's story was featured on a local Crime Stoppers TV segment. A caller alleged that Chad had become involved in a substance deal with some people living in his Madison apartment complex. These individuals had recently moved to Madison from Chicago's South Side. Chicago police had intelligence about a substance trafficking pipeline between Chicago and Madison. This raised the possibility that Chad might have been drawn into transporting illicit goods or acting as a driver for people involved in this trade. One of the detectives who had initially worked on the case theorized that someone could have offered the cash-strapped teen quick money. Chad had been trying to save for a move to Colorado and needed all the funds he could get. This detective speculated that Chad may have been eliminated upon his arrival in Chicago after he completed the delivery. Adding weight to this theory, one of Chad's friends later claimed that in 1989, Chad had been paid on 2 occasions to transport a street pharmacist from Madison to Milwaukee. Investigators identified 3 young men as potential suspects, the same individuals who had moved from Chicago to Madison shortly before Chad's death. However, police never found enough hard evidence to charge anyone in connection with the crime. Aside from the prevalent substance trafficking theory, several other ideas emerged about what could have happened. However, these theories are all incredibly speculative and don't appear to be based on any form of evidence whatsoever. For instance, one theory puts forward that he traveled to Chicago for a romantic encounter, but was slain by the boyfriend of the girl he was hooking up with. While this is an interesting hypothesis, it's essentially fiction entirely devoid of any connection to the facts of the case. On June 5, 1991, a security guard at a Super 8 motel near Interstates 40 and 25 in New Mexico checked room 233. The occupants of the room had long since failed to check out as scheduled. The room had been rented on June 3rd by a man under the name Eduardo Collin, who reserved it for 2 people for 1 night. When motel staff entered, they discovered a gruesome scene: a woman hanging from the shower head. Multiple empty alcohol bottles were found in the room, but no signs of a struggle were immediately apparent. The woman appeared to have been deceased for a couple of days, consistent with having died on June 3rd, the same night she checked in. Local police were called to the scene, and the death was initially treated as though she undertook the act herself. The body was in a state of decomposition due to the warm June temperatures and the room's air conditioning being off, suggesting she had died shortly after checking in. No identification was found with the body or in her belongings, and she was registered as a doe. In time, because of a crucial tip in 2021, she became informally known as Becca, the name investigators believe might be hers, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. The unidentified woman was described as a white or Hispanic female between 25 and 35 years old. She stood about 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed around 140 pounds. She had long, curly, strawberry blonde hair and hazel gray eyes. Her ears were pierced, and she had no tattoos or distinguishing scars noted beyond some minor abrasions on her face and leg. An autopsy revealed the presence of heroin in her system, although the medical examiner noted that the level was not lethal unless she had never used before. The official cause of death was asphyxiation by hanging. At the scene, investigators cataloged several personal items that could potentially offer clues to her identity. One of the most significant and haunting pieces of evidence was a photo booth picture discovered on a table in the room. The photo showed the unidentified woman smiling alongside an unknown man. Motel employees believed the man in the picture was the same person who checked in with her, Eduardo Collin, and that the photo was possibly taken at a mall shortly before her death. In addition, a small scale was found on the table with the name George Martinez scribbled on it. Given all the evidence, investigators strongly suspected the scale might have been used for less than legitimate purposes. Further, it was unclear who George Martinez was, or if that name was an alias. Complicating factors somewhat is the fact that George Martinez isn't exactly the most distinctive name in New Mexico. Despite these items and a clear photograph of the victim's face, identifying her proved difficult in 1991 and beyond. Her fingerprints and dental records were taken and compared against databases, but no match was found. DNA profiling was not done at the time, and later efforts were hampered by the fact that her remains were reportedly cremated, leaving only minimal biological samples for testing. That said, I did say, minimal biological samples, not none, and according to one source, some of the preserved evidence from the scene likely contains her DNA. From the outset, investigators faced two central mysteries: who this young woman was and how exactly she met her death. Detectives wondered why a woman traveling with a companion would end up dying alone, with no one reporting her passing. Eduardo was the only verified name authorities had, and he was considered a person of interest. Police are unsure whether Eduardo was simply a witness who fled to avoid involvement, or someone who might have played a role in the Jane Doe's fate. If the death was indeed by her own hand, Eduardo could potentially provide context about her state of mind or identity. If there was any suspicion of foul play, he would naturally be the prime suspect. Tracking him down, however, proved challenging, given the information he provided when signing into the motel was partially false. He did indeed provide his real name and a proper local address, but he listed a false license plate number for his vehicle. Years later, police eventually located his family, only to learn that he had allegedly died of natural causes in the interim. And I use allegedly here because I'm not able to confirm whether the authorities actually had independent confirmation that Eduardo passed away. Based on my reading of the reports and reading between the lines, it appears that way, but it's not possible to say with absolute certainty. But another mystery reared its head when the family was shown the photograph that the authorities believed depicted the Jane Doe with Eduardo. When shown the photo booth picture of Becca and the man, Eduardo's relatives insisted that the man was not Eduardo and that they did not recognize the woman. This family claim cast doubt on the motel staff's previous identification of the photo's male subject. It's possible the motel employees were mistaken due to seeing Eduardo only briefly, or perhaps the family might have been unwilling to admit his involvement even if he was deceased. A significant turn of events came in March 2021, when a new tip revitalized the investigation. According to Albuquerque police, an individual came forward with information suggesting that the unknown woman went by the name Becca and was originally from the Los Angeles area. At present, the case appears to have been at a bit of a standstill since this time. It's unclear if the authorities have been able to successfully extract a DNA profile or if they've retained a genetic genealogy company to help track the case. Even if there is actually no DNA left, I believe that there's a very good chance of solving this case regardless, given that we have a clear photograph of her. I think this case just needs more publicity and exposure for Becca's true identity to be restored to her. The unusual facial expression she's making in the picture is something of a double-edged sword. It's positive in the sense that her photograph attracts people to her story, generating more exposure. The downside, of course, is that we don't have a photograph of her with a more neutral expression to go along with it. The Glico Morinaga incident is one of the most notorious unsolved cases in Japanese crime history. Over a 17-month period, a mysterious group calling itself the Monster with 21 Faces carried out a campaign of kidnapping, blackmail, and product tampering against confectionery companies. The crime spree began with the bold kidnapping of a candy company president and escalated to threats of mass poisoning of candies sold nationwide. The culprits taunted the police with mockingly written letters and evaded capture at every turn. Despite an enormous investigation involving over 1 million officers and hundreds of thousands of leads, the perpetrators were never identified. And yes, I triple-checked that number. Over 1 million officers were involved in the investigation in some capacity from the period between 1984 to 2000, when the case closed. The incident began on March 18, 1984, when 2 masked men broke into the home of Katsuhisa Ezaki, the president of Ezaki Glico, the maker of popular candies like Pocky. Around 9 p.m., the intruders tied up Ezaki's wife and young daughter, then abducted Ezaki from his bathtub. He was driven to a warehouse in Osaka while still naked and held captive. The kidnappers soon issued a ransom demand to Glico. They wanted 1 billion yen in cash and 100 kilograms of gold bullion for Ezaki's safe return. However, Ezaki managed to escape on his own after about 3 days in captivity before any ransom was paid. He couldn't identify his captors, leaving police with few clues. This dramatic abduction of a high-profile executive sent shockwaves through Japan and set the stage for the strange campaign that followed. In the weeks after Ezaki's escape, Glico came under further attack. Several vehicles in Glico's factory parking lot were mysteriously set on fire. Afterwards, on April 16, 1984, a plastic container filled with hydrochloric acid was discovered inside a Glico office building in Ibaraki, the same city where Ezaki had been held. These acts of sabotage were clearly meant to intimidate the company. Around the same time, letters began to arrive that revealed the culprits had adopted the alias the Monster with 21 Faces, a name loosely borrowed from a character in Japanese fiction. Starting in April, the group sent a barrage of mocking letters to the police and the media, ridiculing the authorities' inability to catch them. In one taunting message addressed, quote, "To the police fools," the writers sneered, "Are you stupid? If you're real pros, try catching us." I have to assume that all sounded much more menacing in Japanese. They even gave cryptic hints about their methods, such as mentioning the type of car and equipment used in the kidnapping, though these clues proved useless. The brazen letters, written in an Osaka dialect, were published in newspapers and intensified public interest in the case. In May 1984, the Monster with 21 Faces escalated their campaign by threatening Japan's food supply. On May 10th, the group sent a letter directly to Glico's management, claiming they had laced Glico candies with a deadly cyanide compound. They warned that these poisoned candies would be placed on store shelves if their demands were not met. This threat forced Glico into a nationwide product recall. Supermarkets emptied their shelves of Glico's popular sweets, and panicked consumers avoided the brand. Although no actual cyanide-laced Glico products were ever found, the threat appears to have been a bluff. The scare inflicted massive financial damage on the company. Glico reportedly lost the equivalent of $20 million and had to lay off hundreds of workers. Notably, in a country where lifetime employment was seen as the norm, this had the additional effect of humiliating the executives. The Monster with 21 Faces seemed to revel in the chaos they caused. One letter even gloated over Glyco's losses, as if the criminals' goal was to upend large food companies rather than simply collect a ransom and move on. By late June 1984, after several weeks of this torment, the shadowy group suddenly announced a ceasefire against Glyco. In a message dated June 26th, they proclaimed they were, quote, forgiving Glyco, and the harassment of that company abruptly stopped. Now, some have speculated that a ransom was actually paid here, but there's no evidence to suggest that actually happened. Glyco and the public breathed a sigh of relief, but the monster with 21 faces was not finished. They were about to shift their focus to other targets. Notably, some have speculated that Glyco had indeed paid a large ransom to the group without the knowledge of the public. After backing off Glyco, the extortionists turned their attention to another confectionery giant, Morinaga and Company. In October 1984, a letter addressed to the, quote, moms of the nation warned that 20 packages of Morinaga candy had been laced with sodium cyanide. This time, the threat was real. Police scrambled to search stores from Tokyo to Osaka and discovered more than a dozen candy packages on shelves that had been tampered with. The group had indeed placed lethal doses of cyanide in popular Morinaga products. Interestingly, they helpfully affixed labels on the packages reading, quote, danger, contains toxins, apparently in an effort to prevent any actual harm. Fortunately, no one was poisoned, but the message was chillingly clear. The perpetrators even teased that next time there may be no such labels, implying a future incident could be deadly. The discovery of poisoned candy caused widespread fear. Morinaga's products were boycotted by retailers, and the company had to slash production by 90% amidst the crisis. Notably, this was an even harder hit than suffered by Glyco. The monster with 21 faces also issued direct extortion demands to Morinaga's leadership. On November 1st, 1984, the Morinaga Company's vice president received a letter threatening to destroy the company if a ransom of 200 million yen was not paid. This ransom amounted to approximately $850,000 in 1984, which, adjusting for inflation, is about $2.5 million. The letter even gave detailed instructions for how Morinaga should signal compliance. It told them to place a coded message as a missing person ad in a specific newspaper on a certain date. Morinaga followed the instructions and ran the ad with the secret keywords on November 6th, effectively agreeing to pay. However, the criminals never showed up to collect this money. Around this time, the group expanded their threats to other firms as well, sending similar letters to food companies like Marudai Ham and House Food Corporation. In one incident in June 1984, an undercover police officer posing as a Marudai employee attempted a ransom drop of 50 million yen. However, he noticed a suspicious quote-unquote fox-eyed man monitoring him. Police believed this individual was the mastermind, but he managed to elude capture. The inability to catch the monster with 21 faces became a major embarrassment for law enforcement. The cat-and-mouse game continued into mid-1985, with the criminals continuing to send letters and the police accumulating failure after failure. The stress culminated in a tragic event. In August 1985, the head of the Shiga Prefectural Police, Superintendent Shoji Yamamoto, immolated out of shame and remorse. Just 5 days later, on August 12, 1985, the shadowy extortionists sent what would be their final message. In it, they derided Yamamoto as stupid, but declared that they would halt their campaign. "We decided to forget about torturing food-making companies," the letter announced, claiming that if any similar crimes occurred in the future, it would be copycats and not them. The group's parting words were fittingly both smug and edgy, quote, "We are the bad guys. It's fun to lead a bad man's life." With this, the monster with 21 faces vanished as mysteriously as they had arrived. The crime spree that had terrorized Japan's candy industry for 17 months was over, and the perpetrators were never heard from again. In the aftermath, the investigation slowly went cold. The statute of limitations on the kidnapping of Katsuhisa Ezaki expired in 1994, and by 2000 all possible charges related to the case had reached their legal time limits. In February 2000, with the last statute of limitations running out, the National Police Agency formally conceded defeat in the case, an unprecedented admission of failure. With the culprits never identified, many theories have been proposed about who was behind the events and what their motives were. Investigators explored a wide range of possibilities during and after the case, but no theory could be proven. Anyway, with that said, let's dive into the most plausible theories on this case. One theory is that an organized crime group, or Yakuza gang, orchestrated the extortion campaign. The elaborate planning and daring actions, kidnapping a CEO and executing complex ransom schemes, led police to initially suspect Yakuza involvement. In fact, one early suspect was Manabu Miyazaki, the son of a known Yakuza boss, who bore a resemblance to composite sketches of the fox-eyed suspect. He had a history of anti-police activism and even a past dispute with Glyco, making him seem like a plausible mastermind. However, Miyazaki was cleared after providing alibis, and no direct links to any Yakuza organization were ever proven. While the Yakuza are known for corporate extortion, their typical style is to operate covertly for profit, rather than drawing intense police attention with public taunts. The monster with 21 faces behaved in a way that was atypical of organized crime syndicates, and investigators ultimately found no solid evidence that any established gang was behind it. Organized crime involvement remains a possibility, but if a Yakuza group was involved, they acted very much out of character and were extraordinarily careful to leave no trace. Another line of speculation is that someone with inside knowledge of the targeted companies was acting out a vendetta of sorts. Some thought a disgruntled Glyco employee or ex-employee might have been seeking revenge, or had a grudge against the company's leadership. Notably, Glyco's president had been involved in a labor dispute about a decade earlier, which initially pointed suspicion toward individuals connected to that incident. Others even questioned if Ezaki himself or someone in his family could have staged the kidnapping, though Ezaki firmly denied any such implication and was cleared by police. There were also whispers about possible leaks from within law enforcement, given how the culprits always seemed one step ahead. However, no proof of a police insider was ever uncovered. That said, given the magnitude of the investigation and the amount of officers involved, it does remain a very real possibility. In the end, while an inside job can't be ruled out, exhaustive interviews and background checks on company staff didn't yield any suspects. Some theories claim that rival companies engaged in corporate sabotage to damage Glico and Morinaga for competitive or financial gain. The confectionery market is big business, and Glyco's near-crippling losses during the incident could have benefited its competitors. One variant of this theory suggests a stock manipulation scheme. An investor or group might have shorted Morinaga's stock. Given that they knew the share value would plunge, they could have escaped with a quick profit. Indeed, Morinaga's stock did fall drastically during the panic, which could have yielded huge profits for anyone forewarned of the terror campaign. However, investigators looked into individuals who traded unusually in those stocks and found no conclusive evidence of such a plot. And as hinted at already, this strategy has a major flaw in that any meaningfully large fortuitous trade would have set off alarm bells immediately. Anyone with sufficient knowledge of the stock market to be shorting stocks in the 1980s would likely have been keenly aware of this issue. Despite the plural 21 Faces moniker, some have wondered if the mastermind could have been a lone wolf acting solely on a personal agenda. The supposed gang's dramatic flair and the literary reference in their name hint at a vigilante element. Some have speculated that this was someone driven by a personal sense of superiority over the authorities. The letters displayed an almost game-like attitude toward outwitting the police, suggesting a potential lone wolf who derived a thrill from the chase itself. Perhaps the most interesting theory is that the entire thing was a North Korean psychological attack on the Japanese populace. North Korean agents abducted Japanese citizens in the 1980s and definitely had the resources for such operations. Ultimately, every theory has run into the same wall, a lack of proof, and the true identity of the perpetrators remains unknown at present. In May 2004, one of the most peculiar mysteries in Formula One history unfolded on the streets of Monaco. The Jaguar racing team had taken the unprecedented step of mounting a large, valuable diamond on the nose of their Formula One car as part of a glitzy promotional stunt. During the Monaco Grand Prix, a crash sent that jewel flying and sparked a mystery that's gone on for more than 2 decades. The decision to put a diamond on a Formula One car was born out of a high-profile marketing partnership. Jaguar's Formula One team, under pressure to increase its profile and please sponsors, struck a deal to promote the Hollywood heist film Ocean's 12 during the Monaco Grand Prix. Monaco's race, known for glamour and celebrity attendance, was seen as the perfect stage for an attention-grabbing stunt. Jaguar collaborated with an international diamond company, which provided a set of flawless diamonds to be used over the race weekend. Each Jaguar car would carry one of these gems in its nose cone during the Grand Prix. These were no fake crystals or low-value props. Each stone was a genuine diamond valued at around $250,000 at the time. The use of real jewels was intentional, and the risk was part of the appeal. A costly gem on the front of an F1 car added real jeopardy to the promotion. Not surprisingly, no insurer would underwrite such a stunt, and Jaguar acknowledged that losing the diamond was a calculated risk they had accepted from the start. With the world's attention on Monaco, the stage was set for what was either a massive unintentional publicity coup or a costly misadventure. On Sunday, May 23, 2004, the Monaco Grand Prix got underway after a couple of failed start attempts. Christian Klein, a rookie driver for Jaguar, started near the back of the grid. Within the first minute of racing, trouble struck hard. Klein's vehicle ended up tangled with a Jordan car driven by Nick Heidfeld, a German driver. The contact broke Klein's front wing, which became wedged under his front wheels, robbing him of steering and braking. Essentially a passenger at that point, Klein went straight ahead and slammed nose first into a barrier. The impact ended his race on the first lap. The car's nose cone, carrying the diamond, was buried in the tire wall after the crash, and circuit marshals quickly moved in under yellow flags to clear the wreck. Klein was uninjured, but Jaguar's bold PR jewel was now in jeopardy. Immediately, Jaguar team members and management were concerned not just with their driver's health, but with the fate of the precious uninsured stone. Notably, one of the Jaguar managers is on record saying that his immediate concern was for the diamond, not for Klein, which is a heck of a thing to admit publicly. Safety regulations prevented the team from joining the trackside recovery during the race. The shattered car was hoisted away by crane, and the race continued as Jaguar anxiously awaited the chance to inspect the nose. It was only after the Grand Prix had finished, roughly 2 hours later, that Jaguar personnel finally accessed the retrieved car. To their dismay, the diamond was nowhere to be found. The gemstone that had been securely fastened into the nose cone before the race had vanished at some point during the crash and its aftermath. News of the missing $250,000 gem quickly made headlines, adding a dramatic twist to Jaguar's promotional gamble. Spectators near the crash site had reportedly even scoured the area in the aftermath, hoping to spot the glittering prize. With the Jaguar diamond officially missing, Several theories emerged to explain what might have happened to it. One straightforward possibility is that the diamond was simply lost in the crash, never to be recovered, with no foul play involved. The impact at the barrier could have dislodged the diamond, sending it flying into an area where it was effectively irretrievable. In that scenario, the small gem could have been overlooked amid the debris. It might have ended up swept aside with other shattered car parts when the track was cleaned, potentially ending up in the trash. The most popular theory, and the one initially assumed by Jaguar's team, is that someone at the scene picked up the diamond and kept it. A Formula One crash draws plenty of eyes, and Monaco's track is lined with spectators and marshals in close proximity. When Klein crashed, pieces of his car, including that nose tip with the diamond, were scattered. A quick-thinking track marshal or an enterprising spectator could have spotted the glittering stone and pocketed it before officials knew it was gone. Given the value of the diamond, such a finder would have strong incentive to keep it secret and perhaps sell it quietly at a much later date. There were hundreds of people in the vicinity that day, and any one of them might have picked up a tiny gem without being noticed. Despite the strong likelihood of an opportunistic grab, no culprit has ever come forward, and the missing jewel has never been traced. The theft theory thus remains unproven, but very much alive in fans' minds. Another line of speculation is that the disappearance was not entirely a random accident or opportunistic theft, but involved some inside knowledge or planning. One version of this theory suggests that Jaguar and its partners might not have been as reckless as they appeared. Under this theory, when they couldn't obtain insurance for it, they put on a replica diamond. This replica, not having the hardness or other qualities of an actual diamond, may have simply shattered in the incident. Supporters of this theory question why race officials would have allowed Jaguar to affix an ultra-hard small projectile to the nose cone to begin with. But perhaps the most far-out theory of all is that Jaguar put a fake diamond on the nose cone of a rookie driver, knowing that he was far more likely to crash than a veteran driver. Under this theory, the real PR stunt wasn't putting the diamond on the vehicle, but the media coverage surrounding the loss of the diamond. On March 21, 2000, 23-year-old Greg Weiss Jr. left his father's home in Princeton, Louisiana, intending to visit a friend in the nearby community of Taylortown. He was last seen in the early evening that day, driving on U.S. Highway 71 near the intersection with Willis Road and Highway 527. According to a friend, Greg was dropped off at a bar along Louisiana Highway 1 later that evening. After that point, Greg Weiss Jr. vanished and was never heard from again. When his family realized he hadn't returned home or contacted anyone, they grew concerned and reported him missing. Just a few days after Greg's disappearance, on March 24, 2000, a critical discovery was made. Greg's dark brown 1984 Chevy pickup truck was found abandoned on a roadside in the Taylortown area. Inside the vehicle, investigators found Greg's wallet and other personal belongings, but no sign of Greg himself. The truck appeared to be in working condition, and there were no immediate indications of a struggle at the scene. The fact that his vehicle and wallet were left behind suggested that something unexpected had happened. Given these circumstances, the Bossier Parish Sheriff's Office quickly began treating Greg Weiss's disappearance as a possible case of foul play. In the days and weeks following Greg's disappearance, law enforcement officers undertook extensive efforts to find him. They interviewed the friend who last saw Greg and followed up on the account that Greg had been left at a bar on Highway 1 that night. Investigators canvassed the bar and surrounding areas, hoping to find anyone who might have seen Greg after he was purportedly dropped off, but found no evidence that he was there. Police also extensively searched the vicinity where Greg's pickup truck was found abandoned, looking for any clues or evidence, but again found no further evidence. As of now, there's no indication as to what may have happened to Greg, and his case has attracted surprisingly little attention in the media and online. Rona Louise Moneson was an 18-year-old freshman at the University of South Florida in 1972. Originally from Long Island, New York, she had moved to Tampa for college and lived in a campus dormitory. On the morning of October 2nd, 1972, Rona told friends she was heading out to a local store on an errand and would be back shortly. She drove off in her gray Chevrolet Impala, but never returned to her dorm room. When Rona failed to come back or contact anyone, her friends grew concerned. It quickly became apparent that the college student had vanished without a trace, leaving investigators baffled as to how an ordinary trip to the store ended in her disappearance. For 3 days, friends and authorities anxiously searched for Rona. Their worst fears were confirmed on October 5th, 1972, when Rona's lifeless body was discovered in a pond about half a mile north of Skipper Road and 30th Street, just outside the USF campus. An autopsy revealed she had died from blunt force trauma in a brutal assault. The location of her body, thrown into a remote pond, suggested the perpetrator took fairly significant efforts to conceal the crime. Rona's car was found abandoned at a nearby apartment complex parking lot, adding another layer to the mystery. Investigators processed the Impala for clues, but whatever evidence they found wasn't enough to identify a suspect. Police didn't publicly name any person of interest, and no obvious motive, such as robbery or personal vendetta, was apparent. With so many unanswered questions, various theories about what happened to Rona Moneson have emerged over time. One possibility is that Rona fell victim to a chance encounter with a violent stranger. She disappeared during a routine errand, and there were no immediate suspects, which suggests a random predator might have crossed her path. This theory supposes that an opportunistic attacker abducted Rona near the store or along her drive, inflicted the blunt force injuries, and then dumped her body in the pond to hide the crime. Others have speculated that someone Rona knew, perhaps a fellow student or an acquaintance from the area, could have lured or coerced her. Given the time frame, some have wondered if Rona's slaying might be linked to other unsolved cases or serial offenders operating in Florida in the early 1970s. Her death occurred just weeks after the unsolved abduction of 13-year-old Gail Joyner in the same area, leading some to question if a single offender could be responsible for both. Those who support this theory suggest that Gerald Stano, a relatively unknown but extremely prolific offender, may have been responsible for the slaying. Despite these theories, investigators have never confirmed any specific suspect or motive in this case. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy just reminding you to subscribe and share if you've made it this far. Anyway, let's get back to the content. The Knights Templar, a famous medieval military order, have long been the subject of legend and theories. One of the most persistent claims is that the Templars secretly worshipped a mysterious idol called Baphomet, a charge first levied against them during their 14th century trials. The term Baphomet first appeared decades before the Templars' trials during the Crusades. In a 1098 letter, a crusader described the Muslim Turks at the siege of Antioch, calling upon Baphomet, which most scholars interpret as a corruption of Muhammad. Medieval European crusaders generally mischaracterized Islam as idolatry. They believed Muslims worshipped Muhammad as their god. By the late 13th and early 14th century, Baphomet had thus entered the Christian lexicon as a term connoting a pagan or false idol. Against this backdrop, the Knights Templar fell under suspicion. On October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France ordered the mass arrest of the Templars in France, motivated largely by his debts to the wealthy order and a desire to seize their assets. Philip, with the cooperation of Pope Clement V's inquisitors, accused the Templars of numerous heresies. Over 100 charges were leveled against the order, including denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, illicit practices, and worshipping an idol named Baphomet. Notably, many of these accusations mirrored those earlier aimed at other enemies of the Church, such as the Cathars, suggesting a template of charges rather than unique misdeeds. Under the pressure of torture and imprisonment by the medieval Inquisition, some Templars confessed to these charges. The idol of Baphomet featured in several such confessions, though descriptions of it varied wildly. According to the trial records, different Templars gave contradictory accounts. Some described a head, others an idol with 3 faces, and others spoke of a human skull or a cat figure as the object of veneration. It's important to note that no physical idol or tangible evidence of Baphomet was ever produced. The name Baphomet itself didn't even appear in the initial arrest warrants or the formal papal charges. Those documents only generically accused the Templars of adoration of idols. The specific name emerged from the interrogations, suggesting it was driven by the questions or expectations of the inquisitors. Of 231 knights interrogated in Paris, only 12, barely 5%, confessed, under torture, to knowing anything about Baphomet. Notably, far greater numbers confessed to other charges, such as more routine claims of blasphemy. This disparity indicates that even under extreme duress, the Baphomet charge was not widely substantiated compared to more mundane forced confessions. However, the inquisitors didn't take this to mean that Baphomet didn't exist as an object of worship, but rather that the Templars held Baphomet so dear they wouldn't name the idol. During the trials, many Templars withdrew or recanted their confessions when not facing torture, and contemporaries were often skeptical of the more outlandish accusations. Even Pope Clement V initially doubted Philip's allegations. Outside France, papal investigations in other regions such as England, Portugal, and the Holy Roman Empire found little evidence of heresy. Many Templars in those regions were eventually exonerated or given light penances. In France, however, Philip's political pressure prevailed. The Templars' Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, after years of imprisonment, dramatically retracted his forced confession and declared the order's innocence. For his audacity, he was put to the torch in 1314. Modern historians widely agree that the Templars' supposed worship of Baphomet was a false charge lacking any genuine proof. The overwhelming consensus was that the confessions were both coerced and unreliable, and relied upon typical methods associated with the Inquisition. Notably, many contemporaries didn't believe the Baphomet confessions to be legitimate. However, they did suspect that many Templars had become crypto-Muslims. Modern historians generally dismiss the idea that the Templars would suddenly, en masse, adopt the doctrines of their mortal enemies. That said, there were cases of individual Templars converting to Islam. Robert of St. Albans, an English Templar, became Muslim and joined up with Saladin in the 1180s. For this action, he was granted the right to marry one of Saladin's relatives. These acts shocked Christendom and may have led to the idea that Templars harbored secret sympathy for their enemies. Importantly, no credible evidence has ever emerged that the Templars venerated anything called Baphomet. Although the Templars were dissolved, then subsequently exonerated by the Church in later years, the lurid idea of their occult practices didn't vanish. After centuries of obscurity, the Baphomet legend was revived in the 19th century amid a resurgence of interest in the Templars, Freemasonry, and the occult. Enlightenment and Romantic-era writers began speculating about what hidden wisdom the Templars might have possessed. In 1818, Austrian Orientalist Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall published an essay that claimed to find Templar Baphomet idols and linked the order to Gnostic sects. Famously, a major turning point came with French occultist Eliphas Levi. In the mid-19th century, he famously illustrated Baphomet as the Sabbatic goat, a winged, goat-headed androgynous figure laden with esoteric symbolism. Levi took the name Baphomet, which he believed the Templars had used, and transformed it into a symbol of cosmic balance in his occult philosophy. Since this time, Levi's goat-like depiction of Baphomet has become the best-known image of this entity. That said, it's important to remember that the Sabbatic goat was never historically associated with the Templars, nor was it based on contemporary Inquisition accusations. The idea that the Templars worshipped a demon named Baphomet is in essence a myth, but it's a myth that still has a ton of cultural weight almost a millennium later.